Here are 19 tips and tricks that you need to know if you have a PSVR2. I've now had mine for 2 months and I have come up with this list of things that I think are super important. So stick around because some of them you need to know. Let's go. First of all, some tips when you actually are going to use your PSVR2 before you start. Now, there are a ton of things that you can do to make sure that this isn't blurry and that the vision is clear. But the first thing and the most important thing you need to do is use one of these. Now, before you put this on, you're going to make sure you want to clean the lenses. You want to do this with a microfiber wipe, something more like you would use for your glasses instead of a surface. And that's because as this thing is on your head throughout your play sessions and just throughout sort of days while it's sat on the side, it's going to be picking up dust and it's also going to be picking up grease from your eyelashes and stuff like that. It's just one of the things that your body does. Your bodies are gross. So by keeping a lens wipe handy, you're going to make sure this thing is staying as clear as possible all the time. Secondly, you're going to want to check the IPD as often as possible. Ideally before every time you put this thing on. The reason is that it's very easy to turn this dial accidentally and change the IPD. Essentially, you turn the dial to move the lenses in and out and different distances apart. Now, when you take your headset off or someone picks up the headset or just walks past it and puts their hand on it, you can actually adjust that dial by accident. It's pretty easy to do, and that will change the IPD when you're not using it. Now, make sure that you do adjust your IPD to get it spot on, and that will give you the clearest vision. That does move us on to our next tip, which is a way to access the quick menu. Now, you can access the screen to make it easy to change your IPD, so you can use the eye tracking to do that, and you do that from the quick menu. The obvious way to do that is to press the PlayStation button, and then you see a big box which says quick menu and you can navigate to that. But the quick way to bring up the quick menu is just to double tap the PlayStation button. If you do that, it will just pop straight into that PlayStation VR2 quick menu, and you can easily adjust things like the IPD. Now, tip number 4 when it comes to having clear vision on this thing is to make sure that you are adjusting the head strap properly. Now, there is a sweet spot and it's going to feel slightly different for different people, so me showing it to you on my head isn't necessarily going to work, but just make sure that when you're adjusting it, you do move it up and down as well as just around. What I do find is that after having this for a little while, you will get quicker at finding that sweet spot, and it just becomes a bit more of a habit. You know where it is when you put it on. And the 5th tip, which will make sure your experience looks as good as possible, is to make sure you set up eye tracking. Now, eye tracking might not seem like the type of thing that is necessary for this headset, however, it is super important. A lot of games on the PlayStation VR2 use something called foveated rendering, which is where it tracks your eyes to make sure the place that you're looking is as clear as it should be. Now, you want to make sure your eye tracking is set up properly, because if you haven't done that, it's not going to make the most of the foveated rendering, and you're potentially going to be looking at things that haven't been fully rendered. Now, another thing that's super important is you're going to make sure you want to take good care of this headset. And I don't just mean not throwing it around and getting it broken and damaged, but something as simple as leaving it in a windowsill. See, the problem with a lot of VR headsets, including the PlayStation VR2, is that these lenses are slightly exposed. The problem is if you leave these in direct sunlight, the lenses are actually going to magnify the sun onto the screens behind them, and it's going to just essentially destroy the screen, and you're going to not have this for very long. Now, the PlayStation VR2's design is actually pretty good because there are a lot of ways to sort of have shade on there. So make sure you're putting it somewhere where this side is facing the window instead of this side. Now, another problem you might face with the PlayStation VR2 is things like tracking. Now, there are a couple of things that you can do that can help with this. The first thing and the most obvious thing to do is just to make sure that the room you're playing with is nice and bright, and it's not too plain. The tracking works based on these cameras, and it finds things around the room to lock onto, and that's how it knows where you are. If it can't see them because it's dark or there's just not a lot of stuff around, it's going to have an issue tracking. Now, the second thing you can do to improve tracking, and it's going to make a huge difference if you're having issues, is enabling enhanced tracking. Now, I found that when I was playing next to my TV, because it's a fairly big TV and it was showing what was happening on the headset was having a lot of trouble tracking itself because a massive portion of what I could see was the room moving around and things happening inside the game. It can't latch onto those things to track, so it was losing tracking. If you enable enhanced tracking, what it does is on your screen it creates this sort of border around the picture that's playing. Then what it does is it uses that border as a reference point, so it knows where it is in conjunction with that border. It completely transformed the tracking for this for me, because when I was first playing with it, I didn't have that switched on, and it was a bit of a nightmare, honestly. And then as soon as I did have that switched switched on, suddenly I didn't have any tracking issues at all. Now the next tip isn't necessarily just a PlayStation VR2 feature, but just a feature that's great for the PlayStation 5 as a whole. That is voice commands. You can turn your PS5 into a very own smart assistant. Now it's not going to be able to do all the things that something like an Amazon Alexa can do. However, if you want to quickly launch apps and games without having to sort of go through your navigation or look through sort of deep menus if it's something you haven't played in a little while, then it's actually going to be something that's really good. Especially when you put the headset on, you can just ask the PlayStation to open a particular game. So you put headset on, switch it on, controllers on. Hey PlayStation, open Hogwarts Legacy. Throws you straight in and there's no faffing in between. Now another little tip that you can do to streamline your PSVR2 experience is to make use of changing this button here. Now in certain multiplayer games, your headset is used as a microphone to communicate with other players. And that's great, it's perfect, but sometimes you don't necessarily want to have your mic on all the time if there's people in the room with you, someone's trying to talk to you, or you're just playing in a loud room and you don't want to annoy people with feedback. The problem is that these remotes don't actually have a way to quickly mute the microphone. You have to go into the settings to do that. What could be easier, instead of using this button here to enable the camera pass-through, you can actually change it to become a mute button. Now, as much as it might seem that it's a bit annoying to have to sacrifice the camera pass-through and able to turn this into a mute button, actually, you can open the camera pass-through in, I would say, an easier way than pressing this button. Now, personally for me, this button is a bit of a faff to be able to find. I tend to find myself when I have the headset on, feeling around for it for ages, going to the wrong side. It's a little bit annoying. A quicker way personally for me to go onto camera pass-through is to use a tip from earlier. If you double tap the PlayStation button, open up that quick menu, and then just press X, it immediately goes into your camera pass-through, and you can just press circle to come back out of it. Personally for me, far quicker than fumbling around for that button on the headset. Now, as good as the PlayStation VR2 is, it isn't perfect, and there are a few issues with the display, and some complaints that people have to do with light bleed. Now, this is in high contrast areas. If, like, for example, with white text on the black background, it can feel like the white text is sort of glowing and it's harder to read, it's not as clear. Now what you can actually do to reduce this is just to turn down the brightness on the headset slightly. Luckily with the PlayStation VR2 it is HDR and it supports HDR, and this thing is pretty bright. So even if you turn it down to about 70%, it's still going to feel really bright in HDR scenes, and actually about 70% is enough to reduce that light bleed. Now for you serious gamers out there, you can use the PlayStation VR2 as a pretty high-end gaming display. Now you do have to go into the video output menu to switch this on. This is actually going to act for you as a 120Hz monitor. So if you've been stuck playing 60 FPS games or you have a 60 FPS TV normally, you can actually play at a higher frame rate with this feature. Now immersion in VR is the name of the game. Being teleported into the worlds that you're playing in is just a completely unrivaled experience. Now, the problem with immersion is that you're fully immersed. You're away from the real world. And with the PSVR2, it's the most immersive headset I've used. One of the reasons is these headphones. They plug into your ears, it cuts out sound from around you, and you just feel fully submerged in the world you're playing in. Now, the problem lies that when there are other people living in your house and they want to talk to you, in order to get your attention, they have to tap you on the shoulder, and that can be, frankly, a terrifying experience when you're in the zone. Now, something you can do to fix this is you can enable sidetone. In your PlayStation 5 audio settings, you can enable sidetone to use the mic of the headset to feed through some of the ambient noise around you. That means if someone says your name and talks to you in the room and they want to get your attention, you can actually be able to hear them as well as your game in the full place. It also means you can hear your own voice a bit better, and honestly, I prefer that way of gaming, especially because I hate being terrified by people coming up and grabbing me when I'm in VR. Now, the next two tips solve a couple of issues, but can require a little bit of investment. The firstly is issues with the wire. Now, I've done a separate video on this and you can go watch that if you like, but it's having wire supports and cable management for your VR wire. The PlayStation VR2 is fantastic, and one of the reasons is because it is a wired headset. Now, you can trip over that wire, it can take you out of immersion. If you use a cable management system like the one I've got here from Kiwi, it can strap your cable to the ceiling instead of draping across the floor. I mean, it gets it out of your way. Now, another issue I found with the PSVR2 is that I didn't really know what to do with it. Now, something like the Quest 2 is quite easy to pack away because it's just, you just put it with its controllers wherever you want, and it's on the side, it's out of the way. Now because this has a permanent cable attached to it, it can be a bit of a faff to pack away, and it can just look a little bit messy if you just leave it out on the side. So I was a little bit disappointed with this sort of permanent cable solution. Now one thing you can do to make your life a little bit easier and make it look a little bit tidier is to get a stand. Now I've got this stand from AMVR, and it actually serves a couple of purposes. Now first is to display your headset and your controllers in a way that looks really nice, and the second is that it actually works as a charger for your controllers as well. Now these controllers don't actually last very long at all, so having to charge them regularly is a little bit annoying, especially if you're having wires draping everywhere. It just looks messy and untidy. With these stands, you just plug in these little USB adapters, and then these sit on there and they're magnetized, so it actually clicks into place really nicely and easily. You can plug the stand into the back of your PlayStation 5 to charge your controllers when you enter rest mode, and it's going to keep everything there tidy and out of the way. Now speaking of your controllers, there are a couple of tips you can do to just make your life a little bit easier when you're using them. The first is when you're holding your controllers and you need to do something with your headset, your controllers can get in the way, whack against the headset. It's just not a pleasant experience. Luckily, because you have this sort of ring design on them, if you want to do anything and you just want to sort of get them out of your way without having to put them down and lose where they are, you can just let go of them and slide your wrists through like so, and they stay where they need to be. You can use your hands to adjust your headset and anything like that, and then if you want to then pick them back up, you can just sort of slide them back down your wrists, easy as pie. Now another important thing about this is the wrist strap. You want to make sure you're using them because you don't want to be throwing your controllers into the TV or anything around you. Luckily, as far as wrist straps go, these are actually super easy to use if you use them the right way. A really quick way to tighten it is to just put your wrist through and just twist, and look at that. Tighten super easily, and then all you need to do is put your finger in and pull, and then it's loosened. Saves having to fumble around to try and find the strap and shake it up and like that. Just makes it nice and easy. So guys, those are my tips and tricks for getting the most out of the PlayStation VR 2. If you guys have got any questions, please do stick them below, or any tips of your own that I've failed to mention here. Stick them in the comments, I'd love to hear them, and maybe we can make a follow-up video if there's anything else. Once you've used all these tips and tricks, the only thing left to do is to enjoy getting into the game. So I will see you in the next one.